Welcome to Making It Last, where we share ideas to help families tackle major issues. I'm your host, Regina DeMeo, and with me today is Jennifer Fairfax. Thanks so much for being here, Jennifer.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So it comes up a lot in my divorce cases that a lot of kids are actually being adopted these days, and I don't know if it's because people are waiting longer, they're like focused on their careers, and then by the time they decide to have a family, they're having more issues. But how many adoptions are there each year, do you know?
Approximately, based on the statistics that we do have, there's well over 130,000 adoptions done in the United States a year, and about 45% of those are domestic infant adoptions.
Wow. Okay.
That's a lot.
Yeah. So let's say a family, realizes that they're having issues and they want to adopt. Like, what does the time frame look like?
Well, it can be different for every family and depending on the type of adoption they choose. But right now, we're telling most families that once they get what's called home study approved, and I know we'll talk a little bit about the process, but that's the first step, and that takes about 3 to 6 months to complete.
Wow.
Once that is completed, it can be anywhere from a year to 3 years, depending on a whole bunch of factors about the family, the type of child they're interested in, what their family dynamic is. Do they already have children? Is this their first child? Their age? A lot of factors go into the timing.
Okay. So what would be the first step? What's the first contact a family would make?
In my opinion, the first contact really should be a private adoption attorney. And that's because most of us, at least in this area, offer adoptive parents or prospective adoptive parents free consultations so they can come in for anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half and talk about all of the options. So when I do it, I explain to clients about international adoption, domestic agency, domestic public agency, and private adoption. And then I'll charge them for it, and it's really a wealth of information that they then can start to narrow what they want to do.
Okay.
And so that's my recommendation of their very first step that they take.
So I have this friend who just completed an international adoption, and they told me it cost them $60,000.
Wow.
Is that normal?
That's quite on the high range. I have certainly heard that before from other cases and other clients. I think, do you recall the country?
Russia.
Russia. So the thing with Russian adoptions in specific is the adoptive parents travel to Russia 2 to 3 times prior to adopting the child.
Right.
So 2 to 3 trips, 2 adults going to Russia, staying for 7 to 10 days, that can certainly increase the cost of the adoptions.
I see.
Not to mention, of course, the cost of the actual adoption. So I have seen those numbers come in with some foreign countries where there's multiple trips required of the adoptive parents.
What would make somebody choose an international adoption versus a domestic adoption?
Sure. Well, there's some advantages to domestic adoption, well, with every type of adoption, and as well as international. With international adoption, what I usually tell adoptive parents is once they get home study approved and once they get their dossier, what's it's called, once they get approved by the federal government to adopt, that's the second step in the process for an international adoption, a home study, and then they get approval from our government to be able to adopt from the foreign country. A child will be identified for them. So I don't want to say the word guarantee necessarily, but a child will be identified for them from the foreign country. And that's different than domestic, where they're actually looking for a child and a birth mother picks them and the birth mother has certain rights that she can carry on until after the child is born. In an international adoption, when the child is identified, the child is free for adoption. There's no risk that a birth parent is going to come back or want any type of post-adoption contact or seek to undo the adoption or anything like that. So there is some guarantees built in. There's also predictability. With an international adoption, you're going to know, your agency is going to be able to say, once your dossier is approved, you're going to be identified for a child within 8 months, and the child will come home within 2 years. There's some predictability in the process, and we don't have that in domestic adoption. And that's something that can really bring some peace to adoptive parents, is sort of those sort of certainties, because you have so much lack of control in an adoption that feels like there's a little more control in an international.
Oh, okay, I see. Yeah. So, like, going to the identification of a birth mom in the U.S., how does that happen? I mean,
Well, remember, in the United States, we have two different types of adoptions. We have domestic agency adoption, and we have private adoption.
Okay.
So let's talk first about an agency adoption.
Okay.
Birth moms are identified in agency adoptions by the agencies. They network, they advertise, they have programs to provide support services for expectant mothers who want to make an adoption plan. So they do outreach programs, and the birth mom comes to the agency and says, I want to make an adoption plan.
Okay.
And the agency then works with her and then helps find an appropriate and an acceptable adoptive family for her. And of course, the family then meets her and agrees whether that's a proper plan. It's very different in a private adoption.
Okay.
In a private adoption, there's no agency.
Mm-hmm.
So the adoptive parents themselves are actually out there advertising and networking. They're doing things like, there's websites like potentialparents.com where they can...
Really?
Yeah, and they can put their name and their pictures and a summary about them and information that birth parents can then go and look through the website, and they can identify the type of parents that they might. So they might be looking for a Christian family or a Jewish family or an interracial family.
So you can be that specific?
They can be that specific. And the adoptive parents can as well. They can say, well, we're interested in adopting a Caucasian infant or a biracial infant. So there's some, because you want to make sure that the child, at the end of the day, we want the child to be with a family that's comfortable and willing to parent that specific child. So we want to make sure some of those demographics are matched up.
Okay.
But the adoptive parents also, some that are on Facebook. I have a couple clients who've adopted using the Facebook as their networking. Print advertising, other type of marketing. They might do advertising in other states. And, of course, verbal. Huge. A large percentage of private adoptions are through verbal networking.
Huh.
I'm interested in adopting. I call you and say, hey, Regina, I'm thinking we're thinking about adopting, just so that you know. I send you some information about me. And then maybe you hear from somebody else who says, oh, my cousin's daughter is thinking about making an adoption plan, and you share that information, and it's kind of that word of mouth. And that's a very effective mechanism for adoption.
Wow. No idea.
Yeah.
Huh. So, I've heard, I have this gay couple, they're friends of mine, and they've been putting together like this photo album and getting letters of recommendations from some of their friends and neighbors. What is that about?
Well, part of that is the home study.
Okay.
Okay, so for the home study process, the families, and we should probably just spend just a second on that. That is where a social worker from a licensed child placing agency really does an investigation of the family. So they're going to check references, finances, make sure that their taxes have been filed, make sure that their house is safe. A fire inspector will visit the home to make sure that it's safe.
Wow.
It's a pretty big deal. If you're home study approved, they have criminal background clearances, FBI checks, everything.
Wow.
So that's why it takes that 3 to 6 months. You also have references. So the family will provide friends and family who know them well, and they will do interviews of everybody.
I see.
Then they put together a really beautiful report. It's anywhere from 10 to 15 pages, all about the family and how they're ready to adopt. So part of what you're describing sounds like part of the home study process.
What happens if you fail a home study?
It doesn't happen very often.
Okay.
Let me just say that. As a general rule, the home study agencies want to approve the family.
Okay.
That's their goal. Their goal isn't to find a reason not to.
Okay.
Their goal is to help the family. So, for example, I had clients one time, the home inspector came and they didn't have a railing down their back
Yeah, that's what I'm
outdoor
thinking.
steps. And they had no idea. And they were very worried. And the home inspector said, no worries, I'll come back in 3 weeks.
Oh, okay.
And the home study agency.
So you do get a chance to fix something.
They're going to fix whatever it is or whatever the problem is. The agency is going to call. If I'm the lawyer who's been retained, I'll be involved just to sort of smooth over any issues. But at the end of the day, it's very, very rare that somebody doesn't get approved for a home study.
Okay, so when you're in the process, you're helping the couple through the home study process, through the collection of all the documents they need for...
Some clients do hire me for that. Some choose to do the home study on their own.
Okay.
Some feel more comfortable having a lawyer who's watching the process and maybe assisting them through it. I don't believe clients absolutely have to have a lawyer through the home study process, but they should have somebody prepared that they can call. So that's why that initial consult is important.
Right.
So if they start the home study and they run into one of these roadblocks, that they should be able to call the lawyer, hire the lawyer at that point, and have the attorney assist them.
I see.
But some people just feel more comfortable having me on retainer from the very beginning, and so yes, I'm involved.
Well, it seems like a very complicated process. I mean,
it's time consuming is what it is. When you think about having to go back, you have to get your marriage certificate, any divorce decrees, they have to be certified, you have to have full physicals. It's time consuming.
Why do you need physicals?
Well, to make sure that you're physically capable of caring for a newborn infant or a child, make sure that you don't have a terminal illness, that you're going to be around, what is normal life expectancy, those kinds of things. Again,
so like somebody with cancer may not be such a great candidate.
Depending on the type of cancer, certainly if somebody's in remission, that's usually not an issue.
Okay.
If somebody is, stage 4 cancer and not expected, that's probably not going to get a home study approval. And it's those kinds of cases where they might not get approved, but if they'd met with the lawyer ahead of time, they probably wouldn't have pursued it.
Right, because you would say right off the bat, hey, this is going to be
this is going to be a problem. We may not be able to get through this.
Okay. So after they've done the home study and they've put together all of their documentation and they've retained you, what's the next step?
So that book that you were describing that your friends were making, that's one of the first steps that I have clients do. And a lot of agencies have clients do that as well.
Okay.
It's a book. They can put it together on multiple different websites. It's usually hardbound. It's usually a paper size, 8.5 by 11. And it has pictures of the family. It does not have identifying information. This is a book that's often presented to potential birth mothers. So if a birth mother calls them from their 800 number that they've provided on a website or through advertising or through their email, they can provide this book to her, and it's color pictures, and it's just gives a really good feel of what the family is like and what their environment is and what their neighborhood is without providing identifying information. And that book really is helpful on so many fronts. I mean, it's helpful when they're first being introduced to a birth mom or when they're first presenting it because it gives her a good picture.
And something to talk about, right?
Right. But for the birth mom, from her perspective, this is something that if she makes this adoption plan and places this child with this couple, she's got this hardbound book that's not going to get easily manipulated or torn or thrown away or hidden, that really shows the family that's parenting her biological child. And I just think that that's a wonderful thing for a birth mom to have, as well as a birth father, because that's why we make multiple, because sometimes the book also goes to the birth father.
Okay. And then once the birth mom and dad say, okay, this is the family that we want to give our child to, what would be the next step after that?
So in a private adoption, and we'll differentiate it again, in a private adoption, the next step really is for me to get really more actively involved.
Okay.
Okay, that's when I say to my clients, okay, it sounds like you have an adoption plan in place. Let's get the birth mom a lawyer, wherever she lives. So if she's in their home state, we find a lawyer in their home state. If she's in some other state, Iowa or Texas, we find a lawyer that's in that state. I always use the American Academy of Adoption Attorneys, of which I'm a member.
Right.
We have attorneys across the whole country. And so I use that. And I know most of the lawyers in the academy.
Okay.
Met them, have had different events with them. And so I'll call one of them to represent the birth mom. And that's really the next step in a private adoption, is to get the birth mom to an adoption professional, usually a lawyer. Some states that actually might be a licensed social worker. So in some states, that's the person who interviews the birth mom.
Okay.
And in other states, it's the lawyer. And we get the birth mom to somebody who's neutral, who represents her, who's advocating for her interests, whether it's the lawyer or the social worker, to really find out more about her, to get what we call a social medical history, so a whole history about her and her life and her family, and really make sure she understands her rights, that she's been advised of what the laws are, so that she's as informed as the adoptive parents going into the plan. And then once that information is exchanged and there's clearly everybody's on board, from the lawyer's perspective, we just wait. We just wait for the baby to be born. But from the adoptive parent's perspective, they're engaging in conversations with the birth mom. The adoptive parents might be going to the prenatal records with the birth mom.
Oh, wow.
They are
and sometimes
texting.
they pay for the medical,
so part of that initial meeting with that lawyer is working out what the financial arrangements are going to be. So in Maryland, we're not allowed to pay living expenses for a birth mom. Okay, but we can pay medical and counseling, and so that would obviously be offered, and we want all birth parents to get counseling.
Right.
But in some states, we'll use Iowa since I mentioned it before as an example. Under Iowa law, living expenses are allowed. So if the birth mom lives in Iowa and we're going to do the adoption in Iowa, then we look at what her budget is and we figure out what the expenses are and what's allowed under the law, and the adoptive parent would usually pay for those expenses.
Okay.
And we work all of that out, and all of that should one big thing, it should all go through lawyers.
Right.
Adoptive parents should never be paying a birth mom directly for her living expenses. They shouldn't even be paying her landlord directly. They should be putting the money into an attorney escrow account so the attorney can verify that the person receiving the money is legitimate,
right,
that there's a lease in place, or that the medical bill was incurred, that she went to the doctor's appointment. I mean, that's part of our job as adoption professionals, is to verify these expenses.
Makes sense.
And so that's really the next sort of step that's going on. Meanwhile, the adoptive parents and birth parents are forging some kind of relationship during the process.
Okay, we're going to take a little short break.
Okay.
And then we'll be right back.
This is so cool, Dad. This is so cool, Dad!
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. There are thousands of siblings in foster care who take you just as you are.
Welcome back to Making It Last, where we share ideas to help families tackle major issues. Today we're talking about adoptions, and I'm your host, Regina DeMeo, and with me today is Jennifer Fairfax. Thanks for being here, Jennifer.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, no, this is really fascinating. So we're at the point where they've identified the birth mom, baby's about to be born, and you were telling me that there's a waiting period. They have to wait before they can't go to the hospital and leave the same day.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. And so what happens is, this only happens in cases where the birth mom and the adoptive parents live in different states.
Okay.
So if everybody's in the same state, it's a little different. But what's more important, because the majority of adoptions are what we call interstate. So baby is born. So the birth mom has either contacted the adoptive parents, but they're in the state where the baby is being born.
Okay.
There's a process called the Interstate Compact on Placement of Children.
Wow.
And the short name of it is ICPC.
Okay.
And ICPC came into effect so that we made sure that we knew where children were. So
right,
before it was there, that exactly what you described happened. They'd go to the hospital, they'd get the baby, and they'd go back home. And the only people who knew where the baby was located was the adoptive parents and the lawyer for the adoptive parents, depending on the facts. So what ICPC does is it basically makes sure that we're monitoring when children are being transported across state lines for purposes of adoption.
I get it.
So it's to protect the children.
Yeah.
So what happens is the birth mother's attorney in her home state submits a packet. It includes the adoptive parent's home study, includes the consents of the birth parents, includes medical records to confirm the baby was born to the birth mom, affidavits, attorney information. So it's a nice little packet. And it gets mailed to the ICPC office in the state where the birth mom resides.
Okay.
It can't be mailed even until the birth mom has signed her consent and has been discharged from the hospital. So usually that's a minimum of 48 hours.
Right.
So the adoptive parents are definitely going to be there a minimum of 48 hours.
Okay.
And then depending on when she can sign, it's then submitted after that. So the home state of the birth mom reviews the packet, makes sure that it's in compliance with the laws of that state, make sure everything is in order, and if it is, then they refer it to the state where the adoptive parents live, and it gets sent usually by FedEx. So it usually is a day of travel for the packet.
Right.
It arrives in the next state, and the next state then reviews the entire packet to make sure everything is in order. And remember, if we're doing, 80,000 adoptions a year, that's a lot of ICPC packets. These people are very busy looking over these packets. So there's a lot that come in, and they have to take their time, and they have to go page by page and make sure everything is accurate. I mean, it is their job to make sure of that. Once the home state of the adoptive parents reviews the packet and makes sure it's okay, they then verbally let the sending state, the state where the birth mom lives, know. And at that point, the adoptive parents are allowed to travel back home. That can take anywhere from 7 to 10 days. So the adoptive parents are going to be in another state, staying in a hotel, living and buying their food from the local market for anywhere from 7 to really 14 days, because you have to add the time before the baby was discharged from the hospital. And that's a long time. But once they get that ICPC approval and they bring the baby home, usually petitions are filed and adoptions are almost always completed within 6 months of the placement. And that's a state law.
Right.
Each state has their own rules of when you can finalize the adoption, but on average it's 6 months after placement.
Okay, so let me ask you about the actual petition for the adoption, right? Because the birth certificate does not ever get changed, does it?
It does.
Okay.
It does, actually. The birth mom at the hospital will fill out paperwork that will have her name on the birth certificate.
Okay.
And it may or may not have the birth father's, depending on the circumstances of the birth father. The court actually gets a copy of that, what we call the original birth certificate. When the adoption is completed, the court fills out the paperwork, and a new birth certificate is issued that actually names the adoptive parents on the birth certificate.
Okay.
So now the adoptive parents have a birth certificate that is exactly like the original birth certificate. There's no difference in appearance or any signs or anything.
Okay.
That has them listed as the birth parents, as the parents of the baby. So yes, there is a change in the birth certificate.
So this gets to my next line of questioning. So that means the adoptive parents then have a choice. They could actually choose never to tell this child that they're adopted.
They could. And there was a time where that happened much more frequently. We've moved away from those practices.
Why is that?
Because for the child, for the adoptee, children have the right to know their biological genetic background and their upbringing. And it is encouraged in almost any mental health professional in the field, and myself as an adoption attorney, always advise parents, adoptive parents, to tell the child as early as possible about their how they came into the family. And so we talk about birth books, and we talk about my life books that the adoptive parents create for the baby.
Okay.
It's their life. That has pictures of the birth mom in it. That has pictures of them at the hospital. So that the child knows early on. But you're absolutely right. There are still people who choose not to tell their child. I always get a little nervous when I have the adoptive parent call me and say, so my daughter is 10, when should I tell her she's adopted? And you're like, oh, I think you better go to get some counseling before you tell her, because, by then you've set up a situation where you've really not told the child the real truth of their genetic background, and they're going to find out. They're going to do that 7th grade DNA test or blood test that they do in schools, that you take your parents' blood types.
Oh, I don't know what your blood.
Yeah, there's some in some schools. They're going to figure it out. At some point, and it's better that they have that information from their parents, their adoptive parents, than to find it out through some other avenue.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you know the full details of my own story, but I was told growing up that my father was dead, and so it was. That's just what I was told until I was 19, and then I was told, oh no, he's actually alive. All right, so. All of those years, I kind of just went, and there were no pictures. So I knew I didn't look anything like my mom, but I didn't know where, even just basic things, where did I get my nose from? Where did I get my facial features from? Just the different ways that I would react to things. This was nothing like the household that I grew up in. So I'm like, where did all of these traits come from? And I finally last year went in search of this man.
Good for you.
Yes, it took a long time, but yeah, I finally I tracked him down. We took a DNA test, and I confirmed that he was my dad. And it's just, it's amazing to finally see where all of these things come from. I mean, it's not like he's we can't make up for all those lost years. It doesn't eliminate what my mom did for me, but it's like there was this hole, and I just only recently finally filled that hole.
And that's very normal. That happens all the time. I work with a lot of clients that are either trying to find their birth parents, or it's the birth parent looking for the child they had placed for adoption.
I was going to ask you, so it could be the other way around.
Absolutely.
It could be the birth mom that after 19 years decides, I really want to know what happened to my child.
Exactly.
But aren't the records sealed?
Well, they are sealed, but there's avenues to still get that information. And again, this is all state specific, and I'm going to share the difference between Maryland and D.C. since I work in both jurisdictions. Maryland has a mutual voluntary registry, consent registry. And so if you were adopted in Maryland, or if you placed a child for adoption in Maryland, you can register with the registry. Okay, and basically it's like a matching game. So if you went in there and said, put your name, your date of birth, and information that you knew, and you register that information, and your biological father had also registered that information, the registry people check those all the time to see if there's a potential match. And if there is, they actually kind of investigate to see if there's a potential match. And there's different levels you can do on the registry. You can just register to have information up there. You can ask them to investigate. You can ask them to actually look through your adoption records, try to find your biological parents, try to reach out and contact them and see if they want to have contact with you.
Oh, wow.
So Maryland has that really, which I will say you don't really need a lawyer to do it. A lot of people call me and I give them the forms and I direct them to the website and the person, and I say, if you need help, if you're struggling or if it's difficult, I'm happy to help you. But this is really meant for people to be able to do it without a lawyer, which I think is huge.
What's the website?
It's the DHR website, and what they really need to do is Google Maryland Mutual Voluntary Consent Registry.
Okay.
If they just Google any combination of those terms, it's going to come up, and they're going to go right to the website, and the forms are right there. It's fantastic.
Huh.
D.C. is a little different. So D.C. doesn't have a registry. So in the District of Columbia, you have to file a petition to break the seal of adoption. And so it's and a lot of people hire a lawyer to do it, and some people do it pro se. And again, it is a process that you could do without a lawyer, and it just is your comfort level. Most of the people that hire me are in other states. So they might be in Louisiana or Kentucky or Oklahoma, so they can't really be local, and they just feel better having a local attorney. But you file the petition to break the seal, and the judge reviews it, determines whether or not it's appropriate, and then what the judge does is orders the child placing agency that handled the adoption to investigate. And so they go through the adoption records, try to contact birth parents, and try to exchange information and put people in touch with each other.
Huh.
And then just as a total, my understanding is you can't do any of those in like Texas. So some states don't allow you to do it at all. Other states have easy rules. Other states have semi-easy rules. But it is state specific of where you were adopted.
Interesting. And I guess there's got to be counseling involved. I mean, because I had two friends who were adopted and went in search, again, in their adult life, like after they were 30, for their biological parents. And, in one case, there wasn't really any connection. Like, they are totally from totally different socioeconomic classes. She's glad she got some questions answered, but there's no real lingering connection. In the other case, this person went in search of his mom, and by the time he tracked her down, she died of cancer. And so he did connect with his maternal grandmother and got some more questions answered from her, but, unfortunately, he waited too long to try and track her down, and that person was no longer here. So I think that it's very important to have good, appropriate expectations when you go into the whole thing, which I definitely went through before I went in search of this person because I didn't know what I was walking into. So do you connect people with reunification therapists?
Well, if the client comes to me, I always encourage them to get counseling. It's one of the questions that I ask, and if they are, I usually refer them to an adoption competent counselor. For example, the Center for Adoption Support and Education, which is local here in Maryland, provides a lot of services in that realm.
Okay.
And so I might encourage them to get counseling there. But through each of these processes, the people who are actually doing the case review, like in the D.C., the person it's actually a social worker. And in Maryland, the person they're social workers. They're trained professionals in this specific area. And so they're going to be talking to people about their reasons for doing this, setting their expectations, their goals. That is part of the process that's built in to make sure that everybody is getting the support they need. And, the expectations, setting those are huge. You could end up as, the scenario could be, I've had birth mothers who found their birth children, had beautiful, beautiful reunions, and they have ongoing, loving relationships. And it does not take away at all from the adoptive family in any way whatsoever.
Right.
And then I've had ones where, they kind of connected, but they just didn't continue with the relationship. And, there's disappointment in that. And, people have to be prepared for it. So.
No, and I think as an adoptive parent, which I guess is the ones that you work with the most, they just have to realize that it's normal. It's normal to want to seek this. But like in my case, my mom was really mad. In the other case, yes, all those ones that I know, the adoptive parents were a little bit resentful, and I think they just have to realialize it's not about them.
I think it was the time. Adoptions 15, 20 years ago were mostly closed, where you didn't have sharing information, you didn't have post-adoption contact.
Right.
The adoptions I do now, 99% of them are open adoptions where people have ongoing contact. And so it is definitely the norm now, but it wasn't the norm 20 years ago. And so that's an adjustment people have to make from so many different angles. But it is very normal, and I've never met an adult adoptee who has sought birth parents who did it for any other reason than wanting to know about their own medical history, their genetic history, some quirks about them and where those come from. It has nothing to do with how much they love, respect, and honor their adoptive parents in any way.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
This has been great. If people want to contact you for further information, how would they do that?
Sure. I have a website, www.jenniferfairfax.com. My phone number is 301-221-9651. I answer all the calls myself, so they'll reach me if they call. And, of course, my email, which is jfairfax@jenniferfairfax.com.
Thanks so much. This was awesome.
Thank you. It's been great.
Absolutely. So if you have any show ideas or would like to be a guest on my show, please feel free to contact me at genxsmarty@gmail.com. Thank you so much for tuning in, and see you next week on Making It Last.